a man is discovered lying in a pool of blood, murdered in his own home.
Who would have had a motive and who would use such extreme violence to do it?
He has been stabbed 69 times in a frenzied attack that has left him unrecognisable to his own family.
The viciousness of the attack is hard to comprehend.
The killer is Ian Birley, a convicted murderer released on parole back into the community.
With a long history of violence, drug abuse, and a conviction for murder, why was Birley walking free, and were signs missed that might have saved a life?
1 in 5 murders in the UK is now committed by an ex-prisoner.
From serial rapists,
he harboured dark thoughts about carrying out sexual offences,
to convicted killers.
They'd met in prison, they were out on the streets together.
Free to walk amongst us.
They knew he could have killed again.
Free to murder innocent people.
She stabbed him many times, and then she hid him in a wheelie bin.
I'm Donald McIntyre, and I'm examining how such tragedies happen. Who's to blame? Is it the justice system?
Or are these killers just pure evil?
She gained pleasure from hurting people.
And ultimately, could an innocent life have been saved? This is Release to Kill. Ian Birley is born in 1972. He grows up in Barnsley, South Yorkshire, a coal mining town thrown into deprivation and unemployment by pit closures in the 1980s.
He'd been consistently in trouble with the police from quite a young age and had been to prison 4 or 5 times between 1989 and the mid-1990s.
By 1995, Birley is drinking and living on the streets, where he has a chance encounter with his first victim. Maurice Hoyle is a 69-year-old retired brewery clerk who lives alone in Barnsley.
Maurice Hoyle was walking home from a night out and he came across Ian Birley on the street where he was sleeping rough at the time, and he invited him back to his house.
We only have Ian Birley's version of the evening to piece together what happens next. Maurice Hoyle will not survive the encounter.
So to begin with, as far as we can tell, everything seemed okay between the two men who just met, but then things rapidly deteriorated.
According to Birley, Maurice Hoyle, who is gay, puts on a pornographic video and propositions him.
Birley suggested that Hoyle had made a proposition to him, trying to kiss him. Now, Mr Hoyle's in his late 60s, Birley's in his early kind of 20s. They'd obviously been drinking, invited back, pornographic film, and he attacked him. He could have just left.
Ian Birley's claim was that he was provoked to attack Mr Hoyle because he feared he was going to be raped.
Instead of leaving the house, Birley repeatedly bludgeons Hoyle over the head with a whiskey bottle and stomps on his head.
Whether or not he was repulsed by the fact that Mr Hoyle was homosexual, it triggered something in him. It was particularly violence.
Mr Hoyle had more than 40 injuries, fractured eye sockets, fractured cheekbones. The reason he died was actually a piece of his dentures from being kicked had got lodged in his windpipe and stopped him breathing, so a really, really atrocious attack.
The significance of the injuries and the pattern of injuries really demonstrate significant rage. So I would be wanting to think about his relationship with the men in his life. This level of rage really suggests an unprocessed traumatic event from his childhood.
As Maurice Hoyle lies dying, rather than call 999, Birley ransacks the house. He steals anything of value, including Hoyle's watch.
Whatever happened in that house, we don't know. But I think he'd gone there deliberately to rob Mr Hoyle.
Were there any warning signs that Birley was capable of such frenzied violence? Or could no one have foreseen this horrific crime? Retired prison governor Vanessa Frake and forensic psychiatrist Dr. Shahom Daz join me in the Crime Hub to discuss the case.
Why did a 5 times convicted criminal suddenly escalate from burglary to murder?
I think there are a couple of potential factors. One factor that can't be overlooked is that he could have been quite intoxicated at the time. Alcohol can make people who have a tendency towards violence disinhibited and aggressive.
I think the only person that can explain that fully would be Birley himself, why he felt the need to be so violent.
It's extraordinary that it's over 40 blows, and particularly stamps on the head of an elderly person. I mean, it's shocking. That does show a certain pathology.
I mean, it shows that Birley's mental state at that time was extremely agitated, completely lacked empathy. What I think is less clear is whether that was changed because of his intoxication at the time versus his baseline pathology or his baseline personality.
Reflecting on this case, is there anything that could have prevented this first murder?
So I think it was opportunistic. The victim, Mr Hoyle, took Birley back to his flat, and I think at that time Birley suddenly decided that he could take advantage of the situation. It's not as if he had an escalation of increasing violence, which signposted the fact that he's capable of killing. To me, this seems like an impulsive, opportunistic kind of offence.
We are looking always for mitigating circumstances. It's fear, poverty, drug addiction. We get this. But there are some offenders who genuinely are extremely violent and do get a kick out of it.
I suppose the very fact that so many people come from backgrounds of poverty and deprivation, but only a small proportion of them actually go on to offend, and even a smaller portion actually go on to offend violently, shows that those aren't the only mechanisms. It's about so much more. It's about personality, it's about boundaries, it's about your sense of your moral compass, which is related to early childhood experiences.
I do feel that Birley needs to take responsibility for what he did. We can all sit here and say, you know, he grew up in extreme poverty, but there are offenders who have not gone on to commit serious acts of violence, you know, who have grown up in extreme poverty and haven't been down that road.
When you're dealing with young offenders, you're always tending to hope for the best, and sometimes that simply doesn't work out.
No, of course it doesn't. And, you know, unfortunately, there are cases where people just don't want to engage. They don't want to help themselves. They look at the world owes them a living.
When you're looking at young offenders like Birley, do you get an instinct that this is a person for changing?
I think you do. I think you can look at somebody and think, I can see which path you're going to take, and at the end of the day, this just isn't going to end well.
After the murder of Maurice Hoyle, Ian Birley vanishes into the night. But it won't be long before the police catch up with him. At the start of their investigation, police have very little information to go on.
There was no sign of forced entry, and Maurice Hoyle had no known enemies. So initially, there was little hint who the killer might be.
You've got to look at, obviously, you know, DNA, blood spatter, so as much forensic evidence as you could possibly get. You've got a blank piece of paper, you've got a dead body. You look at the dead body and say, I've got to find out as much as I possibly can about you. And that's how any murder investigation starts.
Ian Birley, after killing Mr Hoyle, tried to cover up the evidence of his crimes, and he went and burnt the clothing that he'd been wearing on the night of the attack.
With no sign of forced entry, Maurice Hoyle's friends and family are initially potential suspects.
The police would be looking to piece together some kind of motive as to why anyone would do this to a 69-year-old man who was living on his own, and seemingly it was no harm to anyone.
Police discover that Maurice Hoyle's house has been ransacked and items, including an expensive watch, are stolen. The break in the case comes when they get wind that someone is trying to fence a watch like Hoyle's. That leads them to arrest Ian Birley.
The following year, after Ian Birley had been charged, the case went to trial.
In Sheffield Crown Court, Birley pleads guilty to manslaughter, claiming he acted in self-defence.
Birley was saying that he attacked Maurice Hoyle because Mr Hoyle tried to kiss him, and in effect, he lost his self-control.
But the frenzied and sustained nature of the attack undermines Birley's argument of self-defence.
The courts will not condone that extent of reaction. It would have been a vain attempt to reduce responsibility from murder to manslaughter.
He himself admitted the attack was frenzied. He said he'd lost control and had kicked Mr Hoyle in the face on multiple occasions. But the prosecution suggested that Ian Birley saw an opportunity to take advantage of a vulnerable man and was willing to enact extreme violence to get what he wanted, which was to steal from him.
Birley is convicted of murder and sentenced to life with a minimum tariff of 12 years before he can apply for parole.
Ian Birley starts his prison sentence. Could his time behind bars and the chance of rehabilitation make him a reformed character?
Time in prison goes very, very slow. It's like walking through treacle sometimes. A whole lot of people are watching you all the time, and they write reports about you every year. And, gradually, recommendations will be made to get you through the system and to get you out again. I remember a governor telling me once, my job is to get you out there, get you back out.
Birley has 12 long years to convince the authorities that he is safe to be released back into society.
The biggest thing is about addressing their offending behaviour. So if he makes efforts, genuine efforts, to address the offending behaviour, then that can help. But to do that, he will have to admit guilt, for one, and address offending behaviour to even stand any chance of hitting that tariff mark.
Birley misses the chance to apply for parole after 12 years in prison because he repeatedly breaches prison rules. He even tests positive for drugs.
Our prisons are awash with drugs, and it's the bane of the prison system.
Drugs are freely and readily available in prison. That's no secret. Anyone who thinks they're not doesn't live in the real world. They're probably more easily available in prison than they are on the street.
Finally, after 18 years inside, Birley has made it to a Category D open prison where he is being prepared for release. As part of this, in February 2012, Birley is granted temporary day release.
Prisoners are often released into community on a very brief basis to see how they cope with being in the community with very strict conditions as to what they're supposed to do. And this happened with Birley earlier on in the year that he was released, and actually he broke the conditions straight away by getting drunk and was then recalled straight back to prison.
But after several more successful day releases, he is downgraded from high to medium risk in November 2012. 18 days later, he's in front of the parole board.
The parole board is made up of psychologists, ex-police officers, ex-lawyers, ex-judges. So it's a conglomeration of very, very experienced individuals. They look at the risk of, releasing the offender. They will rely on probation officers and psychiatrists who have particular expertise in looking at issues of dangerousness and recidivism. All of this is put before the parole board, and then the parole board will make a decision as to whether the individual is fit to be released.
The parole board would have been fully aware of Birley's history of drug and alcohol taking and his recent high-risk status.
That would certainly ring alarm bells for me. If I was reading something like that and saying, this guy's only been 18 days at this level, yet we're releasing him already, yet 19 days ago, he was an extremely high risk to the public. So what's changed? That's what I would want to know.
They will have taken the decision based on level of risk, looking at whether or not it was safe to release him, and they concluded that it was.
The parole board decide that Birley can be released on licence as long as he lives in a hostel, submits to regular drug and alcohol tests and reports weekly to his probation officer. With hindsight, this release would prove catastrophic.
This is a guy who simply appeared not to value human life at all, certainly not above his own interests. What kind of rehabilitation, what kind of assessments go on in prison for an individual like this?
For a life sentence prisoner, their entire stay in a prison will be assessed, whether that be psychology, probation, security. He'll be sent to a prison that specialises in life sentence prisoners because they do have specific needs, and every 6 months an assessment will be written on him by the staff on his wing.
So all assessment and all rehabilitation is tailored to the individual. The psychologist will look at the risk factors. So in this particular case, in Birley's case, one of the biggest, probably the most significant risk factor is his drug and alcohol use. So that will be the main focus of his rehabilitation. After that, they might look at other relevant factors, so anger management, and then, as you say, a psychological assessment.
So Birley, he was given a minimum 12-year sentence and yet served an extra 6 years. Why would that be?
His tariff was the 12 years. That is the absolute minimum he would have been able to do. Anything over that 12 years is his doing. So it would have been all to do with his behaviour in prison. It could be drug taking, it could be assaults, it could be violence in prison.
And how problematic is it returning an offender back to the community, which had been, I suppose, a repository for all their previous problems and trigger points for their crimes?
I think it's a huge issue. If you're returning somebody to an environment which has the triggers which caused them to offend in the first place, whether that be availability of drugs, whether that be gang members that they associate with, then there's always a risk that they can reoffend.
In terms of patterns of behaviour, how confident can the parole board be that somebody is actually ready for release?
I think there's always an inherent risk when you're releasing somebody from prison, and the parole board can only use the information that they have in front of them. So if somebody is playing the game to a degree, and if their behaviour has settled for a significant period of time, then at some point the parole board is likely to take a risk and discharge that person.
And how tough is it for an offender to readjust to the community, to society, after 18 years in prison?
I think 18 years is a very significant period of time, especially considering Birley was so young when he was first imprisoned. I'm sure the world has moved on, particularly in the space of the internet and social media. So I think it would have been a challenge, absolutely.
They are given an incredible amount of support, both inside and outside. But, you know, one can never tell. If the triggers are not dealt with whilst they've been in custody, then, you know, I think you're going to have issues later on down the road.
Ian Birley spent 18 years behind bars for an unbelievably brutal murder. Despite many missteps in prison, he eventually convinces the parole board that he is ready for release.
Ian Birley has served 6 years on top of his minimum 12-year sentence. Although he's now released back into the public, he's on life licence, which comes with some very strict conditions.
Birley returns to the Barnsley area. He must live in a supervised probation hostel, and his licence requires him to be tested regularly to make sure he isn't using either drugs or alcohol.
So when Ian Birley was released on licence in December 2013, a release that had already been delayed because he'd been found to be taking drugs in prison. A month later, he was found to test positive for taking alcohol.
He consumed alcohol. He shouldn't have consumed alcohol, and he should have been given probably a verbal warning. But what happened in effect is he was given the equivalent of a final warning.
2 months after that, he tested positive again for alcohol, and no further action was taken. In May that year, he tested positive twice for methadone, and once again, rather than being recalled to prison for breaching the terms of his licence, no action was taken. In fact, he was given another final warning.
Because a final warning had been given for the first offence, there was nowhere for them to go other than recall, but they didn't recall him. A final warning should mean what it says on the tin. Final means final, so if it's not final, then what is it?
For Birley, the message seems clear. He can do what he likes without fear of serious consequences. Despite the many infringements of his licence conditions, probation fails to recall Birley to prison. Instead, he is given even more freedom.
In 2014, Birley was no longer subject to regular drug testing and was allowed to leave his supervised hostel. He relocated to Montwalk in Womwell, about 5 miles from the centre of Barnsley and just a short distance from where Maurice Hoyle, his very first murder victim, lived.
Now living in the community, away from the watchful eye of the authorities, Birley only sporadically attends probation appointments, again without consequences. And because the probation service has no provision for drug testing in the community, they have no idea what Birley is up to.
They seem to be under the impression that he'd been drug and alcohol free for a number of months, but certainly it did prove to be an error of judgment, because it did allow him access to those networks of people who were also taking drugs and alcohol, and he very quickly fell back into a pattern of taking very serious drugs like crack cocaine and possibly heroin.
By this point, Ian Birley is very much entrenched back into his drug-taking lifestyle. He also finds a girlfriend, someone called Helen Nichols, who he starts living with.
Helen Nichols is a serial thief who has been jailed 7 times.
Helen Nichols was a very troubled woman who had her own background of drug addiction and was under the care of the NHS Trust for the mental health and drug addiction problems that she had.
This should be another massive red flag. But again, it's never acted on because the Mental Health Trust and the probation services do not share information. Later, that would be identified as a factor that may have contributed to the tragedy to come.
Effectively, a very, very violent man with a very, very violent past and also a history of drug and alcohol addiction himself, was living with a very, very vulnerable woman who had massive ongoing drug addiction issues.
Birley is using drugs and alcohol and living with his addict girlfriend. No one is stopping him. So what message is that sending to Birley?
And of course, he was in his probation hostel and he was being monitored and he was getting drug tested. But as soon as that protective umbrella goes, then he enters an entirely different, unrestricted world.
Of course he does. And once he's left that safe environment, he's with his girlfriend, who's also a drug addict. You know, his gates are open.
I have to say that decision really confuses me, because if he's already in a probation hostel and he's providing positive drug tests, then that shows an increase in risk. So moving him out of there and decreasing the overall level of observation and support surely increases the risk further. So I can't understand why that decision was made.
This was a very violent man. This was a vulnerable woman who was a drug addict herself. So, you know, that to me smacks of warning signs straight away that he has now another person who's also a drug addict to lead him down a wrongful path again.
I mean, the fact he was given a final warning and then he was given a final warning. I mean, this is a system of the process not following its own rules.
Well, I think that he probably pushed the boundaries and he realised because he was getting away with these minor breaches and there were no consequences that he could continue his behaviour to a degree. As for what it says to the system, it could be that services were so overstretched, the probation officers had so many clients, the majority of whom might be deemed as high risk, that they simply they had to push their resources onto those people that were overtly aggressive.
If you've got rules, why aren't you following them? His original offence, why he served the 18 years, was a very vicious murder. And clearly the triggers are there, the drug abuse, the missing appointments, the failed drug tests. So, to my mind, they had ample opportunity to recall him, and in the right circumstances.
The complete lack of punishment for the many breaches of his licence means Birley is now on the streets with no drug monitoring. And he believes he can behave exactly as he wants.
He broke the terms of his release incredibly quickly. We can be formulating this individual as having antisocial personality traits. So we know in antisocial personality disorder that consequences and punishment don't mean the same thing, and rules are there to be broken. So where you're giving somebody lots and lots of rules, you're sort of setting them up to fail. If you do set any rules, the consequences of those rules need to be consistent, they need to be adhered to. And in this case, we've got an antisocial offender who is breaching the conditions of his licence and nothing's happening, which sort of confirms his worldview, that he doesn't need to adhere to social and societal norms, and that those rules aren't for him.
Birley's drug and alcohol habit spirals out of control.
It was as if the 18 years in prison never happened, and his next attack bore all the hallmarks of his original killing.
So in 2015, John Gogarty was living in the village of Wombwell, and he was quite a well-known local character. So he was actually known in the local area as Irish Paddy. He obviously stood out from the fact he wasn't from South Yorkshire.
He was a very quiet man, quite reserved, very funny, kind of very dry sense of humour.
Nicola Gogarty moved to the UK when she was 1, but she and her mother returned to Ireland a couple of years later. John Gogarty stayed in the UK, but Nicola always remained close to her father.
I would have seen my dad quite regularly when I was a child. I used to fly over, so I did see him a lot, and then he came over, obviously, to see me.
In 2015, John was living on his own. He owned quite a few properties and was well known in the area as a wealthy landlord.
Ian Birley, on the other hand, is desperate for money. Money to feed his addiction, and more importantly, to pay off a drug debt. He owes £500 for crack cocaine he was meant to sell on, but instead consumed himself.
And he was coming under increasing pressure to pay back £500. And Birley was heard to tell associates that his plan to get the money was to rob John Gogarty.
John Gogarty seems the perfect target. Late in the afternoon of July 13th, 2015, Ian Birley and his girlfriend, Helen Nichols, set out to rob him as he returns home from the supermarket.
They were actually watching my father, and my father had came back from doing his grocery shopping, and he left something in his car and went out to get it, and because he was in his slippers, and my dad only puts them on when he's in for the evening. And they followed him down the road and shoved him into the house.
Got into the house and forced Mr Gogarty to give them his bank card and PIN number. Helen Nichols was seen on CCTV going up the street and withdrawing money from Mr Gogarty's account at a nearby cash machine.
When Nichols returns with the cash, Birley lets loose in a frenzy of violence.
He was brutally murdered at the hands of Ian Birley. Stabbed 69 times.
Once again, Birley robs his victim of valuables, even stealing Gogarty's champagne.
A number of days after John was murdered, his youngest son was very concerned because he'd not heard from him for a while, and he entered the property and found his father dead, curled up in the fetal position on the floor, covered in blood.
I was hysterical. And I don't really remember a lot. I had to get a flight to the UK, and my husband kind of organised everything.
In an echo, really, of the Maurice Hoyle investigation, the police had to look at who would Mr Gogarty have opened the door to, who would have had a motive to kill a man who was doing no harm to anyone, and who would use such extreme violence to do it. One of the key pieces of evidence they found at the murder scene was a receipt from the cash machine.
Police tracked down CCTV of a woman using John Gogarty's bank card and launch a public appeal for information. Within days, they have Ian Birley and Helen Nichols in custody for questioning.
Ian Birley effectively went no comment. Helen Nichols, however, did finally eventually tell the police what had happened.
Helen led them to where they buried or burnt their clothes and the knife as well, and they drank one of my father's bottles of champagne as well after. So she did lead them to all that.
Another pensioner killed at the hands of Ian Birley. Did the drugs fuel this frenzied murder, or is he just an evil man? The desperate need for drugs, you would have met this with offenders all the time. It's hard to underestimate that drive to get those drugs right now.
Completely. The need for the next fix overtakes everything. It is an absolute, above all else, sell my mother, to get the next fix.
This was premeditated and orchestrated, which doesn't seem to explain the frenzied attack at the end.
I think the fact that the attack was so frenzied really speaks to Birley's state of mind at the time. So he was obviously very agitated. I think an explanation for that could be a degree of drug intoxication.
I don't buy the drug intoxication line because, if you're out of your tree on drugs, you're enjoying that, and then you're going to get up and you're going to get more money to get high again.
Yeah.
He's planning, he's thinking, and then he goes into, literally hell. 42 kicks to the head of an elderly person, and next thing, 69 stab wounds. There's something wrong with this guy. He gets a thrill. He's a bad guy. There's something nasty, intrinsically evil about this character.
Well, as a forensic psychiatrist, I might not use the term evil, but the equivalent would be antisocial. Somebody with an antisocial personality disorder has traits like being completely callous, lacking empathy, being aggressive, not learning from mistakes, not caring about the rights of other people, breaking the law. So I think absolutely Birley had all of these personality traits. In terms of his previous offending, there are the two killings which, as you say, and I completely agreed, were extreme, they were brutal, and they were very frenzied. In between them, he was a regular offender, but it was low-level violence. So it seems to me he's somebody that has the potential of being extremely violent, and when he's in that moment, he loses control, and he goes to absolute extreme ends of violence, possibly because he's gaining some degree of pleasure from it.
I think he got a kick out of it. I do. I think that the ferocity in which he carried out both attacks, he would have been covered in blood, but none of that fazed him at all. He was enjoying kicking somebody to death or stabbing somebody. So he stabbed him so hard he broke a couple ribs. This is pure frenzy, pure, almost uncontrollable urges.
It concludes with them celebrating and drinking champagne they stole from the murder scene. And that says to me something vicarious, pleasurable, rather than something necessarily driven by the intoxicated, drug-induced state.
Yeah, I think the celebration says to me that an absolute lack of empathy. So in that moment, Birley was enjoying himself, and I think that he saw his victim as nothing more than an object for his own financial gain. He just had absolutely no remorse, no shame. He didn't care to any degree about this poor man's life.
Birley is to stand trial for murder. But the real justice will come 4 years later when the family convinced the authorities to hold an inquest.
Ian Birley and his girlfriend Helen Nichols were arrested within a week of John Gogarty's body being found. But Gogarty's family would wait another 4 months before they got their day in court.
And Ian Birley has no intention of making the trial any easier on them.
At the criminal trial, Ian Birley pleaded not guilty to the murder charge, thus put the family through hell as they had to sit through the criminal trial and sit through very, very graphic evidence of their father's murder.
I think Ian Birley, pleaded not guilty to murder because he wanted to get a whole life tariff. Apparently it's like some badge of honour to have in prison, and that's why he put us through, a 4-week trial.
The jury in the trial are not told about the first murder, as Birley's lawyers successfully argue that he couldn't get a fair trial if they were informed.
He was kind of laughing at different times, and like it was, I don't know, kind of a joke to him, or, he was getting limelight, if you like, which I think he quite enjoyed. Ian Birley denied ever being in the house, so he denied the murder all the way through the trial.
But a remorseful Helen Nichols tells the court what happened that terrible day. Her evidence proves crucial in putting Birley at the murder scene.
From what she says, she didn't know that a murder was going to take place. I think she probably feared Ian Birley and went along with whatever he said.
In the end, the jury only need a few hours to find both offenders guilty of murder.
We were told by the judge that we had to be silent and show no reaction or really emotion. So as a family, we just held hands and were silent, which was really difficult.
Helen Nichols is sentenced to life with a minimum tariff of 20 years. Ian Birley gets his wish and receives a whole life term.
Ian Birley was sentenced to life in prison and was told by the judge in no uncertain terms that he would never be released.
To know that he'll die in prison is good. I felt like justice had been done, but there was always something in the back of my mind that I just knew there was more to the story than, what was brought up at the trial.
The family want an inquest held to find out why this dangerous killer was not recalled to prison before he murdered their father. It takes 3 years of legal battles to convince the authorities.
Usually, once you've had a criminal trial, you wouldn't then have a full-blown inquest. So we had to persuade the coroner that the criminal trial wasn't enough, that there were other questions that needed answering and that they could only be answered by an inquest.
The coroner said that there was only the second occasion in his 27-year career where he'd been involved in an inquest being called after a Crown Court trial.
And we learned that there was a lot of missed opportunities, that Ian Birley probably should have been recalled to prison in May 2014. We learned that my father probably would still be alive today if that had been done. And I suppose that was a light bulb moment, if you like, for us as a family, to know that really that we were kind of right all along,
There were a number of shocking discoveries at the inquest, listening to the evidence about the sheer amount of drug taking that was going on, and serious Class A drugs like crack cocaine. How did he manage to hide that so well, or how did they fail to pick up on that?
The coroner concludes Birley should not have been given a final warning for the first violation of his licence.
The problem stemmed back to the final warning that had been given for the first breach, because once you'd gone there was nowhere else for them to go other than recall. He wasn't recalled, so effectively any sort of disciplinary action they took just lost all its bite.
The coroner says that the second final warning sent the wrong message to Birley. He is also critical of probation's inability to test him for drugs and alcohol once he left the supervised hostel. The coroner also concluded that the lack of communication between Nichols Mental Health Trust and probation, together with the other factors, could have prevented John Gogarty's murder.
The events of May 2014 as a whole amounted to a missed opportunity to take action, which would, more likely than not, have safeguarded Mr Gogarty from an attack the following year.
I think it was preventable. And that's very hard to live with, you know, and it's something that we'll obviously have to carry with us, but it's still shocking, you know, to this day, so.
Ian Birley will never set foot out of jail again. What have we learnt from this double tragedy?
Where in the course of Birley's offending might an intervention have worked and saved maybe one life or even two?
So I think there's a couple of potential areas. His rehabilitation whilst he was in prison during the first sentence. He was in there for a very long period of time. But of course that would have needed an element of insight, motivation and his own engagement for it to have worked. And for me, another gaping hole in his overall support and care was when the red flags started showing after his first release. So he was providing positive urine drug tests. So I think serious consideration should have been given to recall him, and if not, then at least increase the level of scrutiny and supervision. And finally, he was moved from this probation hostel. So he went from this supported environment with lots of observation to having almost complete freedom. And if those things had not been overseen, then I think this savage, brutal murder could have been prevented.
And what is a final warning? I mean, if you're given a final warning, the system gives you a final warning, and then it gives you another final warning. It seems as if the system clearly failed in that respect.
I think we all agree that the system failed. Certainly, if we're going to have a final written warning, then once that's breached, that was it. He should have been recalled to prison. Final is final to me.
I think for me, I mean, I operate as a criminologist and journalist. We operate in a reasonably rigid and rational arena. But when you see the ferocity of these two crimes, you know, I can't help but saying, listen, sometimes there are bad and evil people who do bad and despicable crimes, and I see no level of mitigation in it, and I see the same frenzy in this first crime as a second crime, and there's, you know, lots of murders, but very few with 69 stab wounds.
To my mind, it's a person that's completely out of control, who has no emotional intelligence to understand the actions that they're taking.
It's unimaginable this family had to suffer like this, to lose a loved one, when there are plenty of opportunities to prevent it from happening.
I can't imagine how they must feel at all.
I think for them to have known that their loved relative went through such a horrific ordeal must be really, really upsetting. But to have to live with that knowledge, also knowing that there were opportunities to prevent that, and there was a system in place, but the system itself wasn't effective, must hurt all the more.
I do feel like we are the ones who have been given the life sentence. And the families are left to just, you know, deal with this monstrosity of a crime and try and rebuild your life, and it's absolutely horrendous. And what families have to go through when something like this happens.
When an offender like Ian Birley plays the system and goes on to kill for the second time, then the system is broken. John Gogarty paid the ultimate price for these organisational failures. When a final warning to a convicted killer is not treated as a final warning, then the risks to the public multiply. These are not hard lessons to learn, but hopefully, murders like this will never happen again.